Welcome to the SciPhi Show, where we talk science and philosophy with two leading atheist philosophers, Alex Malpass and Dan Linford. And today we're going to talk about the argument from reason. This is most associated with C.S. Lewis. And apparently Lewis was utterly humiliated when he debated it at the Oxford Socratic Club. But more of that later in the show. I think the most succinct version of this argument comes from Max Baker-Heitch. So let's dive straight into that and let's have a look at what he had to say.
I think the best way to summarize the argument is actually with a quote from someone else, JBS Haldane, who was a philosopher who influenced Lewis. But Lewis obviously thinks this is a very key passage, and I do kind of think it encapsulates the argument, and it just goes like this. If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. They may be sound chemically, but that doesn't make them sound logically, and hence I have no reasons for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms.
Dan, what are your thoughts on this sort of opening gambit? I won't go into too much detail because we're going to have like some more detailed versions of the argument later. But quick thoughts on this.
Right. I mean, so the basic motivating move here is to point out that there's a distinction between the causal relationships that there might be between events, right? So we can think of, for example, a series of dominoes being tipped over one after another. That's a causal series where one domino falling causes the next domino to fall. Compare that with a series of inferences where you have you have a premise, maybe a collection of premises, and from those premises you now make a logical inference. Now, you could imagine a device like a computer that where these two kinds of sequences are matched up, right? So when a computer is reasoning and reasoning correctly, right? I mean, as I think people should be familiar with by now, it's possible to make a computer reason poorly. But if you sort of force a computer to reason correctly, then it's going to be making a sequence of inferences, and that sequence of inferences are going to line up with the sequence of states inside of the computer. Those are states of a digital circuitry, and those states of a digital circuits, each one causes the next, right? So there you have a causal sequence that lines up alongside an inferential sequence. But notice that these don't have to come together, right? So for instance, suppose you have a bunch of, I don't know, maybe a bunch of blocks that are spelling out a bunch of sentences. And now you come and you topple over the big pile of blocks, and right now there's this causal sequence that ensues, and the letters in the blocks get all scrambled up as the blocks get scrambled apart and everything. And notice that this causal sequence has nothing to do with whatever inferences might be made from the propositions that were originally written on the blocks, right? So causal sequences and inferential sequences come apart. And now the issue is that our brain states are related one to another as a causal sequence. So what would it be if your mental states really are just brain states? Lewis is wondering, what would it be that would make it the case that the one sequence lines up with the other sequence, right? That's the challenge that Lewis is posing here. And if there isn't a good reason for thinking that those two sequences would line up, Lewis is going to claim, well, then we don't have any particularly good reason to trust the deliverances of our minds, right? We don't have any good reason to think that we're actually thinking or reasoning appropriately as opposed to inappropriately. If there's really just this sequence of brain states that are related one to another causally, but not necessarily inferentially.
Right. Alex, any opening thoughts on the argument?
Yeah, it's a bit like, we complain a lot about the sort of basic bitch, like objection to atheism, which is, the atheist is a materialist. He's like saddled with these extreme reductive positions or whatnot. And this is like the main argument that spawned all of those memes, I think, because it's supposed to be like the way that you show that theism is true is to show that the atheist who, because of this sort of sleight of hand, is saddled with all these implausible positions, or at least these kind of radical reductive positions, can't explain something. And that means that their position must be false, and then sort of by default, the theist shows that their position must be true. That's kind of what's going on the big picture here.
Yeah. So I don't want to get too far into the history, but there are some antecedents to Lewis's arguments. There's a politician that lived over 100 years ago named Balfour, and he had a version of this argument before Lewis did. And then more broadly speaking, one of the things that, so some viewers may notice that this resembles in certain respects the design argument, or certain versions of the design argument. People imagine that, well, hey, you couldn't have a random assemblage of atoms that comes together to form the kind of organization you find in a living organism. Well, those kinds of arguments all go all the way back to ancient Greece, where the Epicureans imagined that living things really do just come together from the random assemblage of atoms. And they were imagining that over sufficiently long time, you'd eventually get assemblages like ourselves. If that was the kind of view that an atheist was saddled with, then it might be rather mysterious why it is that the sequence of brain states gets to line up with the series of inferential states, right? So part of the challenge here is going to be to see whether the way that science has developed since, for example, ancient Greece, is able to give an explanation for why we should expect brain states and inferential states to line up with one another. And I hope, too, that the audience appreciates that no side of this debate should be saying that inferential states and causal states, even when we're talking about the brain, that they always line up, right? I mean, obviously, people reason incorrectly, and so all sides of the debate should agree that, hey, like, there are cases where you have mental states that are related one to another without being appropriately inferentially linked. And maybe part of what's going on is that one mental state causes another mental state without being implied by the proposition represented in that first mental state.
Right. It's interesting. There's a quote I found from Haldane himself about this argument. I thought it'd be fun to read it out because I think it's related to what you just said, Dan. So let me put it up here. Okay, so here's the quote. And it's about, chemical weapons used in war. So, quote, Lewisite is a poisonous liquid with a poisonous vapor called after American chemist Lewis. British anti-Lewisite, or BAL, is a compound invented by Professor Peter of Oxford, which neutralizes its poisonous effects on men and animals and would have been used had the Germans used Lewisite against us. He goes on to say, Mr. C.S. Lewis is a fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, which has become one of our principal defenders of Christianity. His argument seems to me to include many of which definitely muddy the streams of human thought. If I can precipitate some of them, I shall help to clear the stream, thus performing in the mental sphere a task similar to that of Peter's in the chemical sphere. He goes on to say, if the universe is not the work of a creative mind, he argues, that thought is merely a byproduct of chemical reactions in the brain. But if so, he asks, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? Unless I believe in God, I can't believe in thought. So I can never use thought to disbelieve in God, he goes on to say. In fact, if we are the work of an almighty mind, and yet with no exceptions or possibly one exception, our moral conduct is imperfect, is it not at least highly probable that our reasoning powers are equally imperfect? As a matter of fact, we know them to be so. For over 2,000 years, all educated men believed Euclid to have proved several propositions, which in fact he did not prove. I don't believe in thought as Mr. Lewis perhaps does, as a process bound to lead to truth. I believed in it as a process which fairly often does. But if I believe in an almighty creator, I should certainly believe that he could make me think anything he wished. and would therefore have no guarantee that my thought processes have any validity, close quote. So that was Haldane on Lewis's argument. But there's also a wonderful story that goes along with the argument. We've got a clip we're gonna play, and it describes what happened when Lewis presented this to the Oxford Socratic Society. And this is a debate club that was actually recently revived by my friends Alex O'Connor and John Nelson. And I was very lucky enough to be invited to the first debate. Weirdly, it was on Does Love Exist? And I think it was on Valentine's Day. How I got a pass to go to a debate on Valentine's Day, I don't know. But weirdly, I must remember it was a day after, I can't remember. But weirdly, I met Max Baker-Highshare and John Nelson, who was one of the founders. He's hosting an unbelievable debate, so watch that. And it's going to be with our very own Alex and William Lane Craig. So, and it's going to be on the Kalam. So we're excited about that, I think, Alex, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it should be good. And I'm trying to do live streams on my own channel every week in the run up to that. So, going to be covering like all of the different sub arguments of the Kalam. So, if you want something to fall asleep to, you can put down in the background.
It's going to go in a lot of detail, and also you're giving away all the strategy to Craig before the debate.
Well, yeah, I can't imagine him watching any of it. Never mind like 11 hours or 20 hours of analysis or whatever it's going to be. Because he can't even be bothered to read the papers that he comments on these days. So,
right.
Let's see.
I know when we've done the shows with Joe Schmidt, he said, well, I only saw a couple of clips that I was shown. I didn't watch the whole. So I don't think there's much chance. All right, let's go to this clip about what happened at the Oxford Socratic Club.
The Socratic Society was a Christian debating club. C.S. Lewis often came to debate the philosophical implications of Christianity or how these religious ideas impacted on society at large. He must have looked forward to one of his debating evenings in which the cut and thrust of the famous Lewis was on display and his opponents were all over the floor. How wrong he was! Sir Anthony Kenny was a priest before he became a philosopher. He knew Lewis's debating opponent well, an immensely gifted scholar named Elizabeth Anscombe. As a philosopher, she would become legendary, as would her encounter with Lewis.
Lewis had published a book called Miracles, in which he maintained that if everything that we say and think is the result of purely mechanical processes in our brain, then there can't be any value, there can't be any truth. Nothing can be either true or false. And Anscombe refuted this with a rather simple argument. She said, suppose I stand on one of those weighing machines that say, I speak your weight, and it says to me, you weigh 15 stone. That is true, even though it is produced by totally mechanical means. And this simple argument did really undercut Lewis's position.
It's a paradox, isn't it? Because a lot of people saw it as a conflict between the Christian Lewis and this bright, sparkly young woman. In fact, she was fervently Christian as well.
Yes, she was a very devout Roman Catholic. That was what particularly wounded Lewis. He felt they should have been allies fighting side by side in the battle against naturalism and secularism. And here he was, brought down by friendly fire.
After the Anscombe debate, Lewis felt humiliated. I remember Dyson telling me that he'd come back to the pub, Lewis, and he put his head in his hands and said, I've been utterly crushed, I've been humiliated. And he wrote afterwards that he'd been obliterated as an apologist. And it's very striking that after that moment, Lewis wrote no more Christian apologetics aimed at converting unbelievers.
All right, great story. Alex, any thoughts on Elizabeth Anscombe's reply to Lewis there?
Yeah, so I think there's this distinction between what Lewis had in his first edition of Miracles, which is the point at which they were debating. And I think, as Anthony Kenny was explaining there, the argument was sort of more rough and ready, much strong, more ambitious argument that was basically saying, like, if your thought processes were the product of the blind mechanical forces, then they couldn't even be true or false. Like they wouldn't, there'd be no value whatsoever, which is more than what we were talking about a moment ago. And that's how Anscombe was able to just point to examples of mechanical processes that seem to, for all intents and purposes, be correct. Show the true rather than the false. And so that sort of simple undoing, I think Lewis had sort of talked himself into a position that when you actually just analyze it with the cold light of reason, like Anscombe's one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. So he was massively outmatched there. So she was able to just cut through the bullshit basically and explain what was going on, why that was like a fallacy. And I think it was just, there was no place for him to hide up on the stage from her forensic analysis, just going through what you were saying. So it must have been desperately uncomfortable for him, and would have been like a legendary event. I don't know that there's any recordings or even a transcript of the debate, so it's a bit unclear exactly. We've just got this hearsay. And then afterwards, there's a second edition of Miracles, which comes out in this, I think it's chapter 2 or 3, which has the argument that we're talking about today, and the argument from reason, and it's substantially rewritten. Although it doesn't really, it's not clear. Like if you have a copy of Miracles, it won't be, you'll have to search quite far in the book, in the small print, to figure out whether you're looking at the original or the second edition. And it doesn't say anything like, I rewrote this because Anscombe said whatever, and it doesn't say thanks to Anscombe or anything like that.
Right, he didn't credit her at all, did he?
No, yeah, exactly. He just sort of doesn't acknowledge. He doesn't like highlight, I got humiliated and had to rewrite this chapter or anything like that. It's not mentioned. It's just rewritten into the version that we know it by today in the second edition.
Right.
And I think so it's a little bit peculiar in this way. I think one of the things to notice is that, for our side, there's just kind of this like rhetorically nice story that, oh, Lewis was so humiliated that he went only to write on like children's stories. It's worth noting like a few things. Like one is that he did revise the book, so the argument did change. And the typical story that gets told is that even if Lewis didn't say that this was in response to Anscombe, that was why Lewis made those revisions. Second, there's various stories about Lewis like weeping after that debate or something like this, but then I don't know, there's other people who relate different accounts of what Lewis's reaction to it was. Some of the sources on different sides of what may have happened there are linked on Wikipedia. It's an argument that in some form or other often gets repeated today, that people, particularly in the internet, are imagining that atheists are going to be saddled with some radical form of materialism, and that furthermore, anyone saddled with a particularly radical form of materialism is going to run into this kind of epistemic problem, that it's somehow human thought is unreasonable or can't be trusted, or there's some defect with it that has to do with our being purely material entities, if in fact one accepts that we are material entities, right? I mean, it's of course also worth pointing out, as we've pointed out many times in the past, that atheism does not entail that we are material entities, nor, by the way, does mind-body dualism, right? So the idea that there's a separate thinking substance like a soul, that sort of view doesn't entail that the distinct soul states are related by something more than just the way that one soul state causes the next. So if the problem really is that you have this sequence of causes, and the sequence of causes doesn't line up with a series of inferences, it's not entirely obvious to me why that problem is somehow obviated or avoided by invoking a soul or a thinking substance or something like that.
Yeah, I think there's a like woolliness around exactly what the thing is that's supposed to be causing the problem. Like, is it on some readings of it, the problem is supposed to be it's materialism So you think then the solution to it's going to be something like dualism, right? But then sometimes, some ways of putting it, it seems like the problem is determinism, right? In which case the problem is supposed to be libertarian, the solution is supposed to be libertarian free will. So is it, is it a mind matter thing, or is it determinism freedom thing? I think it sort of orbits around that question. Often different people put it different ways without realizing that they're doing that. When they're trying to make one and the same argument, you end up making both of these different versions of the argument. And it just, as you just pointed out, materialism, dualism, determinism, libertarian freedom, none of them correlate directly with atheism and theism. So like they're all just, it's all of a big hot mess. It sort of seems like there's an argument there, but it's very difficult to be clear about it.
So I think, if I were to suggest something to Lewis, like, if he were alive today, or if I were talking to one of his present day defenders, like if a student came to me and asked me about this kind of argument, what I would suggest to them is that instead of seeing it as an argument for theism, which may be too high of a target, see it as an argument against some more specific thesis that, say, many physicalists will endorse. And then what you've done is you've pointed out, maybe, if the argument succeeds, a significant problem with a popular form of physicalism, which does not at all get you to theism, but it's that's often the kind of thing that one does when you're taking this more like piecemeal approach to philosophy, where you see yourself as engaged in a kind of research program and you publish papers that take like incremental steps. And so it may be enough for a worthwhile paper to show that some popular version of physicalism has some significant problem with it.
The way I was thinking about it, if physicalism is true, let's face the only way you can realize a mind, then God must be false, because God, well, at least the versions of God that have God as an immaterial mind must be false. So if they can establish that physicalism is false, then it doesn't prove God exists, but it certainly takes one of, what could be a key argument against God away.
Sure.
Is that
or a key argument against supernaturalism, right?
Right.
That it. Yeah. But even so, I think that again, what I would say, like if a grad student came to me, and told me this is what they wanted to work on, this is what I would suggest to them is that they publish this more sort of refined paper where it's like the target is really just that popular versions of physicalism say thesis X, and thesis X is implausible for a reason Y. And then that's a stronger paper too, because thinking about my students, a paper like that's going to be one that's attractive not just to, say, theists, but also to physicalists, right? Physicalists are interested in knowing what the most plausible versions of physicalism are. And if you can show that some popular version of physicalism is implausible, well, that's something that should be of interest to everyone. So it doesn't have to have this like really narrow apologetical aim. It can be an interesting philosophical project on its own, just to show that a popular version of physicalism is beset by some important problem.
Well, if I had got a version of the argument that I found in a syllogistic form, I thought that might be fun to do. So I just found this online, looked for something that had it in that form, found what I thought was pretty good. So I'm going to play that. Actually, before we do it, maybe we should just unpack a bit of terminology here, because they use this phrase ground consequent reasoning. So have I got the ground consequent reasoning is to be contrasted with cause and effect reasoning. So the ground consequent is like the process of inference, and the cause and effect is what causes you to have that. Is that the right summary?
Yeah. So like, it's a nice example to distinguish this. You might say something like, I got this example from something the other day, but it's like you say, like, imagine it's like midday and we haven't seen Phil yet. He hasn't come out of his room. You might say something like, Phil's still in bed because he had too much to drink last night, right? And then that because is like a cause and effect thing, right? But then the ground consequent because, you might say something like, Phil must have had too much to drink last night because he hasn't come out of his room yet, right? And now it's like I'm drawing an inference, right? So one of them was the cause that makes you still in bed. The other one is me thinking, well, he must have. I'm drawing an inference on the basis of you still being in bed. And it's the kind of, I guess it's a confusion or ambiguity about the way that we can use the word because in both of those ways. And I'm almost using exactly the same words in those two sentences. Like, it's quite clear we understand the difference. It's all about the syntax and stuff here. Well, context makes it clear, but the words used are very similar. So I think it can be easy to sort of miss that distinction.
Right. All right. Well, let's play the clip and we'll see what the argument looks like.
Premise 1. If nature is all there is, then the natural world is a closed system, meaning every event has a natural cause. Premise 2. If the natural world is a closed system, then all events, including mental events, are efficiently caused by non-rational cause-to-effect natural processes. Premise 3. If all events, including mental events, are efficiently caused by non-rational cause-to-effect natural processes, then ground-to-consequent reasoning isn't possible. Premise 4. If ground-to-consequent reasoning isn't possible, then none of our beliefs are rationally inferred or justified, including our belief that nature is all there is. Premise 5. If none of our beliefs are rationally inferred or justified, then our belief that nature is all there is would not be rationally justified. Premise 6. If a belief is not rationally justified, there can be no good reason to believe it. Therefore, there can be no good reason to believe that nature is all there is.
Yeah, so no, it's not actually presented as an argument for God. Rather, it's an argument against naturalism.
You can pick through the bones of that argument first.
Yeah.
But if we do that, can you keep the argument on the screen? Because there's...
So premise 1 says, if nature is all there is, then the natural world is a closed system, meaning every event has a natural cause. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why one might deny that premise. Notice what this requires is that if nature is all that there is, then every event that happens would be caused by some other part of nature, and so you wouldn't have uncaused events. Now, the thing that bothers me about this, the reason why I would be attracted to rejecting this, is that I find attractive a position called neo-Russellianism, which is a kind of revival of a position that goes back to Bertrand Russell. It's a position that says that causation is not fundamental to the physical world. Rather, it's a kind of emergent or reducible or non-fundamental phenomenon that has an underlying physical explanation of some kind. If that's right, then any of the events that are in the reductive base of causation, that is to say, the microphysical events that explain the higher level causal events, would not themselves have causes, right? They may still have explanations, but the explanations they have wouldn't be causal explanations. And so that's one reason that I would have for rejecting the first premise. I think that's maybe not the best reason we have for rejecting this argument. I'm willing to put aside that objection to premise 1, because I think that there's more interesting things to talk about with respect to this argument.
Alex, do you have any thoughts on premise 1?
No, I'm okay with premise 1. I mean, least objectionable premise in this argument is premise 1, from my point of view.
I think actually Anscombe did object to she didn't see this syllogism, but I think she did say that modern physics doesn't necessarily entertain causality at a fundamental level. But why don't we go on to premise 2? Alex, what are your thoughts on premise 2?
Yeah, so here the thing that's annoying about this bit of so this says, if the natural world is a closed system, then all events, including mental events, are efficiently caused by non-rational, open brackets, cause to effect natural processes. But then the thing to object to, I think, from here is the insistence that by saying that the cause and effect natural processes are non-rational, that's just sort of saying, to go back to what Dan was saying right at the beginning, that the ground consequent and cause and effect in this case are not lining up together. Because, I mean, if they were, like, if you think about them being a sequence of events in a highly structured brain that's processing, how to catch a cricket ball as it flies across a field towards you, like it's doing the, it's processing information, you think, that the computer would do in order for you to get the correct answer and the outcome. And that those little bits of synapses firing and stuff are just small parts of what is effectively a rational process. So, like, by insisting that those things are not are non-rational. It's like it's sort of excluding the idea that they might be part of a process which is in fact rational, where there's ground consequent relation going on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, it seems like the core. It seems like the core of the argument here. Like, it assumes that the brain processes can't be rational, and in a way, Dan, I feel like the way you linked it up with the design argument is very, very good, because it's very similar. We say, well, you can't get complexity and highly functional organisms through atoms bumping into each other. It's like, well, actually, you can, because atoms bumping into each other can do really, really interesting things. So. Seems to me that this is where the argument really is having its weakest link. Dan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the premise 2 is really the one that I would pick on here. Though I would also point out that, well, and I guess the objection that we were just discussing can also be made. There's a similar kind of objection made to premise 3, perhaps.
Yeah.
But at any rate, I would be inclined to think that the premises 1 and 2, if taken as independent premises, are kind of extraneous, right? I would be tempted to collapse. I mean, again, taking the perspective that a student comes to me with this argument, I would say, well, why not just say one premise instead of 1 and 2? Say, if nature is all there is, then all events, including mental events, are efficiently caused by non-rational natural processes. It seems to me that the causal closure thesis that's needed to link premise 1 and 2 is not really needed as like an additional part of or maybe it could be a part of defending what the new revised first premise would be, but I don't see what's gained by having that as 2 independent premises.
Right. And there's another thing that occurred to me, but I don't know if this is actually relevant, but there's a theory in philosophy of mind called the Bayesian brain, which says, our brain is an inference machine. So, of course, it can do rational things because actually the very process is a rational process. Is that relevant here, do you think?
So I think it's relevant in the sense that it's relevant to a kind of revised version of the argument. Because again, like the reason why the argument on screen isn't a particularly good one is because it rules out the possibility of a mechanical system where a sequence of causes lines up with a sequence of inferences. But it shouldn't be that that's ruled out just because the possibility is somehow incoherent or something, right? I mean, it should rather be an issue about explanation, that if it's really true that the brain just proceeds through the series of states, one caused by another, why should we expect for the states to align with the state with some inferential sequence, right? Given that it's possible for them to do so, that doesn't mean that they do. Right? But if it's possible that they do, then premise 2 is false. Right? So premise 2 could be replaced by some kind of demand for an explanation. Like, why should we expect these to line up? It's sort of similar to something that Alex and I were talking about on his stream the other week. So we were talking about different defenses of the causal premise and the Kalam argument. Right? So the causal premise says that anything that begins to exist as a cause. And then some people imagine that if something could begin without a cause, then you could have all kinds of things like raging tigers popping into existence out of the void. One way to understand that is just as a demand for explanation, right? What explains the fact that you don't find raging tigers doing that? A different kind of argument, one offered by Andrew Loke, says that if the causal principle is false, then there really would be raging tigers popping into existence out of the void. And that argument is way too strong, right? It's likewise, this argument is too strong for sort of a similar reason, that it's not that the argument shouldn't be that it's impossible for an inferential sequence to line up with a causal sequence, but rather that maybe, I don't think this is ultimately true, but maybe there's not a particularly good reason for them to expect to line up. Now, when you put it in those terms, you can ask, what is the relevance of the Bayesian brain? Well, if it's really impossible, as this premise claims, then the Bayesian brain is impossible. If you put it in terms of explanation, as I was suggesting the proponent of this argument should do instead, then their challenge to you would be, well, why should we think that a Bayesian brain would result from completely natural processes, right? That would be their challenge to you. And then there would be some explanation that, say, a cognitive scientist could give for why it is that it would be like evolutionarily advantageous for neurons and synapses and all the rest of the neural architecture to have that kind of organization in order to make sure that at least some of the time, maybe most of the time, inferential sequences line up with causal sequences.
So, Alex, anything else to say on premise 2 and 3? We were kind of treating them as quite similar. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that part of the reason why, at least now I'm thinking through, I can't remember if this is in Lewis's original version of miracles or in the later one, but it's quite a common idea anyway, which is that there's this stuff in the free will kind of discussion where you want to say something like coercion is mutually exclusive with free choice, right? So if somebody puts a gun to your head and tells you to, pick up this beer and have a drink of it or something, then you kind of got to do that. And therefore, by being caused, that entails that you're not choosing to do it freely. So if you can establish that something is caused, then you've established that it's not being done freely. And I think there's something like that going on here, which is supposed to be like, if the thing has been, like if what we're talking about is just simply cause and effect, a chain of cause and effect that goes back through time or whatever, then that just means that one and the same thing can't be the ground consequent, like reasoning relation on the basis that cause and effect is incompatible, like in the freedom thing, where being coerced is incompatible with freely choosing it. It just being a cause and effect relation is incompatible with being this ground consequence kind of rational relation. But I think that's just like being sort of, that's basically another way of saying, I guess it's like a principled way of trying to get to saying why the cause and effect chain isn't lining up with the ground consequence chain here. But it's just another kind of questionable thing. It just seems like, why think that? It just feels too strong and never seems like sufficiently motivated to really nod along, unless you already think it somehow, and then it seems like it's an easier thing to accept on the basis that it fits with what you already believe. But like a skeptic always finds like not enough to hold on to persuade them, it seems to me.
Right. So let's go to premise 4. If ground consequent reasoning isn't possible, then none of our beliefs are rationally inferred or justified, including our belief that nature is all there is. What do we have to say about this, Dan?
Well, I mean, if it's true that inference isn't possible, well, then it's going to be true that none of our beliefs can be rationally inferred, right? Rational inference requires that inference is possible in the first place. And if all that ground to consequent reasoning means is proceeding through a series of inferences, then that's only going to be possible if inference is possible. So in that sense, there's something right about premise 4. But there are some caveats here. So most philosophers, including most theists, for example, are going to be inclined to think that at least some of our beliefs, some of the things that we think, are both rationally held and not inferred. So it's not going to be true that that none of our beliefs are rationally held if inference doesn't exist, right? So even without inference, even if you couldn't do any inference at all, it would still be true that you could still have some rationally held
Can you
beliefs.
give an example, Dan? How could you have a rational belief that wasn't inferred?
Yeah, so a lot of philosophers are going to think that if something seems to you to be true, if it appears to you to be true, and you don't have a reason to doubt it, then you can rationally believe it. So, for example, it seems to me right now that I'm sitting at a desk in my home office, that I'm speaking over this call to the two of you. I don't infer that set of beliefs from some set of propositions. I don't sit here and think to myself, okay, here's a syllogism I'm going to step through. Do I believe that each of these premises? No, I just have the experience that it seems to me, it appears to me that this is what I'm doing, and I don't have any particularly good reason to doubt that it's what I'm doing. So I'm going to think that it is in fact what I'm doing until I have a reason to doubt it. Now, one of the important things to realize is that there's two different paths that you could go down. So Descartes represents one kind of path, or what Descartes says is that he's going to doubt everything, whether he has a reason to doubt it or not, until he can find something that cannot be doubted. And then he wants to reconstruct the entire rest of his knowledge from that basis, right? Maybe we'll call it the Cartesian strategy. Most philosophers think, for a variety of reasons, that the Cartesian strategy fails, that you're not going to be able to find some foundation that cannot be doubted and from which you can reconstruct the entire rest of everything that we can be licensed to think about the world. The other kind of strategy you could have is one where, well, you see, on the Cartesian strategy, stepping back to that for a moment, what's going on is you're holding beliefs you could have guilty until proven innocent, right? You're saying you're going to doubt everything until you can prove it, until you can rationally infer it. So that's kind of like holding those beliefs guilty until proven innocent. The other strategy, the strategy that I was describing, the one taken by most philosophers today, is one where you hold many beliefs to be innocent until proven guilty. You say, well, look, these things seem to me to be true. They appear to me to be true, but I don't have a particularly good reason to think that I'm wrong about them. And so until I'm shown that I am wrong about them, until I am given a reason to doubt them, in other words, then I'm going to hold on to those beliefs. And I think that's how most people act in their everyday lives anyway, right? I mean, it's only when you get into maybe your first philosophy class and you get introduced to Descartes that you start like doubting all these things that you took for granted from your everyday life anyway. The strategy that most philosophers think is the plausible one to have is something like this, is where you have something like the everyday strategy, where you say that various things seem to me to be true. I'm going to take them to be for granted until I'm given a particularly good reason not to do so, right? Which doesn't mean, by the way, that you can just like dogmatically believe anything, because there could be various beliefs that you have for which there are strong reasons to doubt them. It just means that on those things that appear to be true and for which you don't have reason to doubt, then you could be in a position to rationally believe them without going through an inference, right? So even in a world where inference was impossible, it still might be possible to rationally believe various kinds of things.
Right. Okay. I should say they don't have to go to a philosophy class because presumably they've seen sci-fi movies like Blade Runner and The Matrix and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. So maybe before they watched The Matrix, they didn't.
Yeah. But anyway, Alex, should we go on to the next premise now, or you want to say anything? Yeah. Okay. All right. So premise 5 is what we got. If none of our beliefs are rationally inferred or justified, then our beliefs that nature is all there is would not be rationally justified. Any thoughts on this one?
No, I guess not. I mean, fair enough. I suppose it's probably fair enough, actually. Yeah, if none of your beliefs are rationally justified, then this specific belief wouldn't be there. There's not much to complain about there.
Right. And is that the same for premise 6?
Well, I've one last thing to add on premise 5, which this is a very small comment, but depending on what you mean by inferred or justified, again, there might be this problem with, this position I've been describing is kind of this philosophical standard that you say, well, some beliefs are rational without being inferred. And so, maybe someone could object to 4 on those grounds. I think that, what that would require is for them to say that our belief that nature is all there is non-inferentially held rationally. And I think that that's doubtful, right? I think we do have good reason to think that maybe nature is all that there is, but insofar as we do have reason to think that, it's only because we have various kinds of arguments and evidence for thinking it, and not because it's something that we should think non-inferentially.
Yeah, right. It's
And
not
then what
just
about
like
this
feeling of pain or something. You just think that as naturalism is true. Yeah.
What about this last premise? Are we happy with that one? If a belief is not rationally justified, there can be no good reason to believe it. I know you've had the caveat that you've mentioned before, Dan, but other than that, is there anything else we want to say about that?
Well, I guess it just sort of seems like, rationality is one of these very hard to pin down philosophical concepts. And good reason is an even harder one to pin down. But I guess the author here of this supposes them to basically be synonymous with each other. I mean, it sounds to my ear, rationally justified is a higher standard than good reason. It could have a good reason that doesn't quite meet the standards of rational justification, in which case, just because I lack rational justification doesn't mean I don't have a good reason. I might have a good to sub-rational reason for believing something.
You can give an example. Where would you have a good reason but not rationally justified?
Suppose you're like a detective that's got a hunch on a case, a good track record, long 30-year history, something like this. Doesn't really qualify as a rational justification. You can't really explain it to anyone. Doesn't really work for anybody else. Nonetheless, it might be good. It might be the sort of thing that you use regularly to solve cases, and it just works for you. So it's not a rational justification, but nonetheless, it's a good reason to believe it in this case, possibly.
Right. Okay, so how do we want to sum up the argument? I mean, I think we've kind of all agreed that I think that the weak premise is like premise 2/3. We could collapse them into one. That basically you can have physical systems, naturalistic organizations of matter in the brain that will do rational processes. Is that the fair summary here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument that's on screen is too strong because it makes an impossibility claim, right? It makes the claim that physical processes or mechanical processes couldn't possibly be aligned with good inference. And that, of course, we know to be wrong. I mean, it's become even more obviously wrong in the time since Lewis because we have computers, right? And computers are mechanical devices that where the string of causes is perfectly aligned with a string of inferences. Now though, I mean, even in Lewis's time, people should have known this both because there were already computers and because going back a long time before the invention of the electronic computer, there were other kinds of like calculating devices that could do to a limited extent various kinds of similar things. I think even like Leibniz invented one. But the I think there's a weaker argument in this ballpark. It's also a shorter argument, and it's one that I think is more compelling. So here's how it goes. So premise 1, if materialism is true, then all our beliefs are fully explained in terms of non-rational physical causes. Premise 2, causal relations are not the same as logical entailment. Conclusion, therefore, our beliefs are not held because they are logically supported, but because of blind physical processes. So something like that, something in that ballpark would, I think, be a better argument. I don't think it's an argument that succeeds, but I think it's an argument that's better than the one on screen.
It's much more streamlined, that's for sure. Alex, how would you pick apart Dan's version of the argument?
Give me the argument again one more time, Dan.
Yeah. So, premise one, if materialism is true, then all our beliefs are fully explained in terms of non-rational physical causes. Premise two, causal relations are not the same as logical entailment. Conclusion, therefore, our beliefs are not held because they're logically supported, but because of blind physical processes. Now, I should say it as a caveat that, as I've stated it, that argument isn't strictly speaking logically valid. But I mean, I think it's obvious how you could fill it in to make it logically valid.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of another aspect of this, which applies to that version of the argument too, is it's just like, it's almost like a composition fallacy or something, because it's like saying, look, if, when we zoom in on what's happening when, on the materialist account or the naturalist account of when somebody's reasoning, if we zoom in on that, what we find is just sort of blind mechanical interactions between things. And those things are not rational. Therefore, the whole big thing, when we zoom back out again, that whole thing must be non-rational too. And when thought about like that, then it looks like a sort of, is this a genetic fallacy? It kind of sounds like a composition fallacy. It's like saying, if you zoom in on all of the atoms in your body, they're not, like, strictly speaking, visible. But when you put them all together, the big picture of something, it is visible, right? So how come that visible stuff's made out of invisible stuff? That seems like a head scratcher. Then that's basically what's going on here. So how come, if each of the individual steps are mechanical, that the outcome can be rational? That seems to be just a sort of the befuddlement of the apologist here. It's assuming it's almost like, how can life come from non-life or whatever? It's that type of...
I think
I think with my debates, you say, well, how can something non-conscious come out, give you something that's conscious? I mean, it's the same thing. It feels like this haven't heard of the word emergent. It's like,
well, but this is why I think it's better posed as an explanatory challenge, right? So the challenge is to say something about why it is that, even though everything about the system can be sort of exhaustively explained by mechanical processes, nonetheless, you get something rational out of it, right? I mean, it seems almost like the rational side, the rational description is superfluous. So, I think that that's a good question to ask about, right? I also think that we have a good explanation, a good response that's come from the past, like, 200 years of science. That, what cognitive scientists and so on have put together is a story about how it is that you can go from mechanical, biological processes to systems that, for which it is advantageous to not only make inferences, but to more often make truth-preserving inferences and so on, than it is not to make them, right? And so, in other words, there's an evolutionary advantage, at least within a certain domain, for organisms to develop the ability for these mechanical processes to line up with rational processes. And then once you have that kind of explanation on the table, the explanatory challenge is no longer as powerful. Right? I mean, I like the analogy with the design argument, because there's nothing that's going on in the background here, which is like, so philosophers talk about teleology, so things done for a purpose. And for a long time, people thought that the only way that something could be done for a purpose, that is to say, the only way in which a process could be aimed at some end goal, is if there was some, like, uber mind that was directing the whole thing. It is, as an aside, it is kind of funny, because Aristotle actually thought that natural processes could be aimed at end goals without there being some underlying mind. Aristotle actually thought that everything is aimed at what he calls a final cause, which is to say that this kind of teleology, this kind of, like, directedness, is everywhere in nature. But later, people started to think that you couldn't have this kind of directedness unless there was a mind, an uber mind of some kind behind the scenes directing everything. And in fact, that's one of Aquinas's 5 ways, right? So Aquinas takes from Aristotle this idea that things in nature are directed, and then says, but if they're directed, then there must be a mind to direct them. Therefore, there is this kind of mind, that this God must exist. What happens with the development of evolutionary theory is, in some sense, a return to Aristotle, right? So it's a return of the idea that natural processes can be directed towards an end goal, even though there's no director. So your heart, for example, evolved to pump your blood, but there was no one whose end goal it was for your heart to pump blood. And so, in fact, it didn't take a designer for you to have a heart that pumps blood. Likewise, the same thing is true about brains, or at least that's what mainstream cognitive scientists are going to claim, that your brain evolved for many different purposes, but one of them being that at least within certain domains you can make inferences, and then if that's what it was selected for within that domain, then there's no longer a mystery as to why it is that at least this set of mechanical processes lines up well with inferential procedures or logical inferences.
Right. All right, so before we go on to Tim Stratton's argument, do you have any comment on Haldane's rejoinder that, well, if there's a God, then he could give me any thoughts or way of thinking he likes, and I've got no reason to trust that either?
So I guess so. If the option is just between there being blind mechanical forces and some agent that's controlling things, then that choice, it seems to me, is neutral about whether or not one is more reliable than the other. I mean, maybe the person who's directing your cognitive apparatus is nice and reliable, but maybe he's not, right? So if all we say is that there's somebody out there pulling the strings, that doesn't tell you whether you should rely on the inferences that appear in front of your mind or whatever. Maybe they're misleading you. So it seems to me that what you have to do is bake in that he's this lovely person who's got my best interests at heart and wouldn't want me to think anything wrong or whatever. Only then, if you add that in, can you start to think to yourself, it's good that this type of person is directing my mind and presenting my inferences, or whatever the supernatural kind of advantage is supposed to be. It's only there if you bake it into the intentions of this mind in the first place.
So there's an additional caveat you need to bake in, which is that you need to bake in that this entity not only has your best interests in mind, but that your best interest would be served by you having accurate inferences or whatever it is. If often Christians, for example, will make the claim that God works in mysterious ways, that somehow the greatest good in the world or whatever it might be would be brought about by God doing things that, at least quite intuitively to us, seem like they are quite awful. And if that's right, then it could be that for reasons that we can't comprehend, our best interests would be served by our having inaccurate beliefs, or by our believing things that are based on what seem to us like good inferences, but that in fact are not. If people want to see how things sort of have to work here on the theist side, you should take a look at Descartes' Meditations, where I think Descartes makes it quite clear that's what required here is that is some kind of thesis that God wouldn't allow you to be tricked all the time, or that in virtue of being perfectly good, it would mean that your faculties would be reliable in certain kinds of ways. But if you're willing to think that God is sufficiently mysterious, then it's difficult to understand how you could rationally know that that God being perfectly good would mean that your that your faculties would be rational in those ways, and so on.
So I think Haldane
interest. Oh, sorry.
Go on, Nigel. I think Haldane had the example of nuclear scientists, and because he was living in the era just after the first nuclear weapons were developed, and he was like, surely a good God would steer them into making the wrong inferences and not being able to build a nuclear bomb. So if we believed in this good God, we wouldn't expect all the right inferences, because that would be bad.
And I think we can look at everyday life as well. So often when this kind of objection comes up, many theists will say, oh, well, surely God, in virtue of being perfectly good, would be truthful to us, wouldn't want us to be deceived or something like that. But in fact, it doesn't seem right based upon our experience in everyday life. So there's all kinds of examples where in everyday life, it seems like the most moral thing you could do would be to bring it about that another person believes something that's false, right? So if you are hiding Anne Frank in your attic and the Nazis knock on the door, then you should probably lie to the Nazis. That seems like that's the morally best thing for you to do. Now that depends upon you being you being less than perfect in all sorts of ways that don't apply to God, right? Like God has perfect power, for example, in addition to being perfectly good. And so maybe it's just in virtue of the fact that I'm not all powerful that I best serve Anne Frank's interests by lying to the Nazi. Maybe God, if God was there at the door, could do something else to prevent the Nazis from getting Anne Frank. But think about other examples, like maybe there's a child that has a tendency to wander off. Their parents know that there's some woods nearby that are a big threat potentially to the child. Maybe there's some wild animals in there or something that would be a threat to the child. Maybe they're worried about the child getting lost, whatever it might be. But the parent also knows that if they try to explain to them the literal threats that are there, the child won't buy it, and so won't be convinced that they shouldn't go off, wander off into the woods. So maybe what the parent has to do is they have to invent a story. Maybe they have to say like, oh, there's like a witch that lives in the woods or something, and that's why you shouldn't wander off. That keeps the child safe. The child's best interests in that case are best served by the parent lying to the child. And there's even a kind of tradition of this kind of thought in Christian theology. So there's an idea of what's called divine condescension, which is this idea that this is sort of the simplified matters, but maybe oversimplify them. But the idea has been that God meets human beings where they're at. So instead of like going in to explain to like Israelites living 3,000 years ago, instead of explaining Big Bang cosmology to them, maybe God explains to them cosmology in terms that an Israelite living 3,000 years ago would understand in order to deliver like an important theological message, like that, that God runs all reality or whatever it might be. And this will be an explanation for how it could be that, say, Genesis 1 is revealed and at the same time is scientifically inaccurate there, right? Like God meets people where they are instead of, but that involves God being like complicit in the deception of human beings, as far as I can tell. Theists probably wouldn't put it in those terms, but as far as I can tell, it makes God implicit in bringing about that human beings believe things that are false and believing those false things for a long time. And presumably the idea that the Christian would have is that God did that in order to best serve the interests of human beings. And so if all of that is right, then it seems like there could be instances in which human best interests are served by bringing it about that we have false beliefs.
So, Alex, any last thoughts on this particular issue, or should we move on to?
Yeah, just one interesting one is so the original thing at stake was like, if God existed, wouldn't that mean that He would provide you with these kind of reliable cognitive processes or whatever? Wouldn't He ensure that the ground consequent and cause and effect stuff lines up, right, so that we're reasoning in the right way? And after all, God could do that kind of thing. That's a sort of simple thought. And And I did bring up this worry at the beginning. Well, maybe what if God's like not nice? Yeah. So this was originally coming from this thought like, well, if God's nice and has your interests at heart, then he's going to sort you out with good cognitive processes that make inferences and whatnot. And I was saying, well, normally it seems like what they're going to say is, well, as long as God is good, he's going to do that sort of thing because that sort of thing is good. So I just need to suppose the goodness of God, and then I've got reason to expect that on my theory. But interesting, I read a book by philosopher Timothy Mulligan recently, who's an absolute legend, it turns out. I hadn't read much of his work before, but I really like him now. And his book is about a version of theism where God isn't interested in human affairs, which he calls non-anthropocentric purposivism. So there's purpose in the universe, but it's not interested in humans, right? So imagine, for instance, that on the other side of the universe, there are moral agents that are just like much more significant in their actions and their plans and their choices than anything that we do. So they're kind of angelic almost. Maybe they take billions of years to do their epic projects, and they're like on a scale that we can't even imagine. And in comparison to that, we're just a kind of like side product that we barely even gave a second thought to when designing the universe. And our trite, trivial little lives don't really have any significance. So it could be that God is good, and he does in fact try and make the things with moral responsibility in the universe have the relevant cognitive faculties. It's just not us. It's some sort of self-centered, egotistical thought that, well, it must be me that's at the center of the cosmic story, right? And you have to add that as well as the goodness of God. So there's like lots of reasons why just simply appealing to theism isn't going to be enough to guarantee that you have good cognitive faculties, because maybe God doesn't really care about, even if he's good, doesn't really care about your cognitive faculties being reliable.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to Tim Stratton. He's got his own version of the argument related to free will. So let's see what he has to say.
Premise 1, if robust naturalism is true, God or things like God do not exist. 2, if God or things like God do not exist, then humans do not freely think in a libertarian sense. 3, if humans do not freely think in the libertarian sense, then humans are not epistemically responsible. 4, humans are occasionally epistemically responsible. 5, therefore, humans freely think in a libertarian sense. 6, therefore, God or things like God exist. 7, therefore, robust naturalism is false. And then 8, I give an abductive conclusion here, and I say the inference or the best explanation of God, things like God, and human libertarian freedom is the biblical account of reality. And so that allows us to get into scripture and show exactly why this is the case and how this is backed up by scripture. So I love the fact that it doesn't just show that God, things like God exist. It also shows that we have libertarian freedom. It shows that naturalism is false, and it gets us back into scripture. That's a pretty powerful argument.
Right. So Alex, I know alongside Alex Proust, Josh Rasmussen, Tim Stratton is one of your favorite apologists, right?
So it's a crime against philosophy to include those three in the same sentence. Yeah. So Tim's argument is a version of the same thing. This is basically he's saying if robust naturalism is true, by robust naturalism he just means something like materialism, right? Not just sort of methodological naturalism or something, that like the claim that he just basically means materialism, right? I think he means more than just stuff like gods don't exist. He means also something much more like like I was saying before, the basic bitch saddling of the atheist with all of the worst theories you can imagine, and just supposing he has to defend all of them to make your life easier. That's what he means by robust naturalism. And then he's saying if you're that person, you're not epistemically responsible, which is just to say something like you could believe something, but it happened to you in a way that it was passive from your point of view. It just sort of appears in your mind, and you're not responsible for it, whether it's good or bad. It just sort of happens to you. But he says, it's clear that we are sometimes responsible. Sometimes we do have beliefs where we have the right sort of epistemic relationship to what brought about that belief, like justification, that kind of thing. Therefore, the chain of dominoes sort of goes back like a modus ponens, so that means it can't be the starting point of robust naturalism. And I don't know why he adds on this stuff about biblical Christianity there. I mean, it's just gratuitous. He says it's powerful. That drastically weakens the argument. He doesn't understand how arguments work. Like, he's just added a new argument on at the end. And for some reason, that's just a premise on its own. I don't know. Anyway, whatever. You can get lost in the kind of minutiae of what's going on with these people. But yeah, I guess, I'm interested to see what Dan's take on this is as well. But just seems to me, you don't have to spend your life worrying about this, because he will rephrase it and run around in circles and whatnot. But the central thought is just that he's saying basically, unless you freely choose to believe one thing rather than the other, right? He's basically saying rationality involves free choice at some point. So it's not good enough just to have the right reasons leading you to your belief, to your belief. You have to be sort of like when the president says, I want to, do something like attack Iran or whatever. And then his generals will come in and go, there's 3 options for you. Which one do you want to do? Nuclear war, ground invasion, or some helicopters over or whatever. And then he picks one, and he's freely picking that option, right? And I think that Stratton's got this sort of implicit idea that that's how rational processes work. Your brain comes up, you're trying to work out some problem. Your brain presents you with some options, and then you, the kind of sovereign, free soul, decides to pick the option, right? And then if you didn't have that last sort of vetoing final free step, you wouldn't be able to control which thing you actually believe in the end. And that's why you'd lack the responsibility. And it's just the point is that okay, you could believe, that seems a wildly implausible kind of, it's almost a homunculus view of how free will works and rationality works, as if there's this little man inside your brain who's making these last choices or whatever. But let's suppose that was true.
Inside their brain.
Well, yeah, exactly. But yeah, it just seems like I could just freely choose the wrong option by accident, right? Adding the free choice doesn't help unless that draws me towards the right thing. And if it's just free, who cares, right? If I'm presented with two options, you can do A or B, and here are the reasons for A and here are the reasons for B. If the reasons for A are better than the reasons for B, then I'm just being irrational if I freely choose B. Right, adding the freedom one doesn't help. If I was compelled to pick the one that had the best reasons, I would just be compelled to be rational. So, the freedom determinism stuff that he seems to think is so important, he's trying to say it's all about being responsible or whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters is whether your beliefs are correlated with the right reasons, not about whether you've chosen those reasons freely. And the ability to choose against the right reasons is no benefit. It doesn't make any difference. So that's right. Yeah, that's the end of him as far as I'm concerned.
And then I think what you've pointed out here is a way that this importantly departs from Lewis, actually. So for Lewis, the issue is that you have two series, right? You have this inferential series and you have this causal series. And the question is, why should one series align with the other? Stratton says, actually, what's important is that sometimes you form beliefs and nothing determines them. They're not rationally determined by anything beforehand, and they're not causally determined by anything beforehand, right? Just nothing that determines them before. I mean, otherwise, you wouldn't need libertarian freedom. Otherwise, if it was that they were free, but they could still be determined, then that's just compatibilist freedom, and we don't need the libertarian version. If it's really the case that what's needed here is that there are instances in which you somehow freely choose which belief to have next, or which thought or whatever it is, which which mental state to have next, or which mental attitude to have next, then it must be that that's not determined by anything before, whether it's something at the level of rationality or something at the level of causation. And so in that case, you break both kinds of causal series, right? It's not a deterministic causal series, and it's not a deterministic inferential series either. And so it's no longer a question about how these two series line up with one another. Rather, it's that he thinks there needs to be a rupture to both kinds of causal series in order for us to be responsible epistemic agents. And I don't understand, like Alex, I have a similar trouble understanding why libertarian freedom is at all relevant here, right? I mean, it's to me, it seems like the cases in which it's most important for me to think something through are cases where I pause and deliberate, right? Much of the time, the things that the mental states we go through and so on, we don't pause and deliberate about them. Maybe we make some knee-jerk reaction. Daniel Kahneman has this distinction between type 1 and type 2 processes, where one of those two is supposed to be this like fast knee-jerk process that you use every day. And then there's like this more rational discursive process. This is what happens when you sit back to yourself and you have a more reflective moment and you say, okay, let's really think this through. Let's really weigh what's going on both sides. And let's come to a rational conclusion on the basis of the arguments and the evidence. In that case, there's three things that can happen. You could come to conclusion A, come to conclusion B, or you could suspend judgment. If you can come to conclusion A and you're doing so rationally, it's because the reasons weigh more heavily on one side than the other. And if you come to conclusion B, then it's because, if you're doing so rationally, it's because the reasons weigh more heavily on behalf of a reason of choice B. If you suspend judgment, it's because the reasons that are available to you for choosing either one of those two beliefs are just as persuasive either way. And then it's what's rational to do is actually not to make up your mind about which one of those two things are true. Now, suppose that somehow that I'm not seeing, it is in fact rational to reach conclusion A, even when reasons are just as persuasive to either side. That you shouldn't in fact suspend judgment in some case. And, sometimes people will talk about cases where like belief is kind of mandatory, but the reasons to like the rationally persuasive reasons to either side are not compelling. There's cases like if you read, there's a book by Paul Tillich called The Dynamics of Faith, and he tries to pick out cases like this. And on Tillich's account of faith, it's supposed to be that these are cases where you have faith, where belief is non-optional, but also the reasons to either side are not completely compelling. And so it's even though you shouldn't remain uncommitted, it's also true that rationality isn't persuasive one way or another. Suppose it's a case like that. Well, then what's sort of peculiar about that kind of case is that it actually looks exactly like the kind of case that Stratton wants to rule out. So as Alex was reminding us a moment ago, what Stratton is imagining is that if you're not freely choosing your beliefs, then belief is something that sort of happens to you from external means, right? Well, suppose that you choose a belief. There's nothing beforehand that determines that that's the belief that you will choose. So there's nothing that you can see inside of yourself that will mean that you'll choose A as opposed to B. Well, then your belief that A is something that just kind of happens to you. And why? Because nothing inside of you determines that before. Like, in other words, when you start believing A, you then find out which belief you're going to have. Nothing about you determined that beforehand. So now that you're believing A, you say, "Oh, that's the choice that I made. Apparently, I didn't know that I was going to make that choice beforehand. Why does that make you somehow more epistemically responsible than someone who, for example, suspends judgment? It seems to me like what someone is doing in that case, I mean, what's going on with them is very strange. But in any case, it doesn't seem to have much to do with epistemic responsibility. If anything, it has something to do with the epistemic irresponsibility, that there's a person whose beliefs just happen to them and not from anything that they can see inside of themselves beforehand.
I mean, I would find it difficult to just choose to believe that 1 + 1 = 3. And if I did have that ability, I don't know that.
So, but there may be other cases. Yeah, so it's important to point out that there's a medieval philosopher named Jean Buridan, and Buridan imagines an ass or a donkey that's supposed to be equidistant between 2 bales of hay. And when we say equidistant between the two bales of hay, really that's a stand-in for the idea that there's just nothing that should determine that the donkey goes to one bale of hay or the other, right? Everything that could be rationally persuasive to the donkey about the one bale is true about the other, but also everything that all of the physical conditions, anything that could be like physically different about the donkey's constitution or anything that could determine the donkey's choice beforehand. In every other case, where there is something that makes one bale of hay the more likely choice than the other, then the choice making is completely compatible with determinism, right? When you see inside of yourself that you have the most rationally compelling reasons to choose A over B, then you are determined, but also you're like it's rational what you're doing, so there's no problem.
I mean, I think that's very useful as a way into this, but it doesn't like. So the idea is that you've got this deterministic process, like some code or something that's saying,
right,
evaluate the options, pick the one that scores the most according to some scoring system that makes you think that that's the best one. But then what do you do when you've got the situation where there's two that are equal, that score equally?
That's right.
And then if the suggestion is supposed to be, well, then that shows you that deterministic systems break down, that Buridan's ass would just starve to death rather than picking between the two options. And therefore free will must exist, right? It's not very persuasive, probably because like you could just write some clause in so that when the two are equal, just pick randomly, assign them like odds and evens, and then just like take a timestamp and see what the last digit is. Is that odd or even? I'll go in that direction. Why can't a deterministic system just sort of pick pseudo-randomly in that situation? Like the Buridan's ass just picks one, not out of free choice, but out of a kind of a clause written into his deterministic code that just makes him go one way rather than the other, based on some pseudo-random thing. Why not that?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's ultimately what organisms that appear to make choices in these kinds of situations are doing. But there's one of the important things to pick out here is that what it means is that most of our choices are going to be ones where the libertarian and the compatibilist agree, right? The only cases where there's any disagreement between the two theories at all are going to be these cases where the libertarian makes the claim that it's things are just the same to either side as they are to the other, and the compatibilist says, well, they may look like they're just the same to one side or the other, but really, typically, there's something that you haven't noticed that makes a system go towards one as opposed to the other, right? That's the pseudo-random option. Now, I brought up Tillich before. You might think that, Tillich has examples like this where, and this might be more relevant for Stratton than the bales of hay example. So Tillich has examples where just to carry on living life, maybe you have to believe something. Maybe you have to believe that you're going to get that job if you just keep applying for jobs, or you're going to get through grad school if you just keep pushing at it, even if where from you are now, it may seem like the whole world is kind of against you. It might be kind of helpful for you to believe something that gets you through that. And the idea that Tillich has is that it's a case where there could be these cases where things aren't rationally persuasive in one direction. Nonetheless, you need to choose that belief. It seems to me that if we're going to talk about libertarian freedom and belief formation, I mean, that's really kind of the only case that I can think of where this would even matter, right? If there were genuinely these cases where things were not rationally persuasive to one way or another, and yet it was non-optional to have a belief, and not only was it not persuasive one side or another, but there was nothing else hidden, no like quirk of your brain or something that was hidden that made you take one choice as opposed to another. If there were genuinely cases like that, then those would have to be the kinds of cases that Stratton is talking about. The reason I brought up those kinds of cases is because a little while ago, Phil mentioned that, he couldn't get himself to freely choose that 1 + 1 = 3. And I think what at least all good philosophers would say is that, yeah, the compatibilist and libertarian should agree that your choice if you did choose to believe that 1 + 1 = 2, then both the compatibilist and the libertarian are fine with that being a choice that you've made, right? That's not a case where those two theories are going to come apart, because 1 + 1 = 2 is far more rationally persuasive than 1 + 1 = 3. But if there are other cases where it's somehow non-rational to have to pick a belief, and nothing beforehand determines which belief you choose, the kinds of cases that maybe Tillich has in mind, then those are going to be the cases where something like Stratton's view would have some kind of currency. Now, I should also say that I doubt that there are any cases like that. I mean, I think what Alex said is exactly right, that what really happens is that maybe in the reasons that you've consciously represented to yourself, you have just as much reason to either side. But actually, there's some process that's going on inside of you that you may not even be aware of, and that's what actually gets you to choose one or the other. And it may be that in many circumstances, it appears completely unpredictable that someone is going to do something. But again, I can get a mechanical device to do something that looks completely unpredictable. So for instance, people might be familiar with a pendulum where you've got a rod, a mass on the end of it, and it swings back and forth. Take another pendulum, attach it to the first one through the first mass. So now you have two masses, and you allow it to pivot at the place where the second pendulum attaches to the first. Well, in that case, it turns out that the motion of that what's called a double pendulum is very difficult to predict. And if you let that thing run, if you start it at some large angle and then you let it run for just a short amount of time, it will basically break whatever prediction you want to make for its motion. And that's because a double pendulum is a basic example of a chaotic system. If you get to know its initial condition very, very precisely, more precisely than anyone is able to measure, then you'll be able to predict what it does. But of course, precisely because no one has that ability to measure something with that precision, you won't be able to predict the motion of the double pendulum. And likewise, it's often the case that organisms that make choices that are very difficult, even for the organism itself to predict beforehand, let alone for anyone else to predict beforehand. If the double pendulum can do that, and it's a deterministic mechanical process, I don't know why we should think that the fact that an organism exhibits that kind of behavior would tell us that somehow there's something going on inside of an organism that's less than mechanistic.
Alex, why don't you sum up the situation for us? What do we think? Your concluding thoughts about the argument from reason.
Well, so I think that the argument from reason is, well, from my point of view, it's very, very implausible. It rests on a bunch of really rather implausible things. So just sticking with Stratton, because we were thinking about that most recently, his implausible assumption seems to me is that libertarian free will is a component of rationality. Or another way to think about it is that he thinks that knowing something is a justified, true, freely chosen belief. But there's no good reason to think that we should insert that sort of fourth clause into the knowledge definition. He doesn't have anything good to say about that. Even on his view, presumably he has some account of doxastic voluntarism where he's in charge of which beliefs, otherwise he wouldn't be responsible. But obviously that doesn't go all the way down. Right? He's not in charge of his subconscious processes by definition. So even if he's like the president choosing between options, the brain is just doing stuff that he's not in control of and presenting him with the options. And if your brain is calculating wrong and it's telling you that the good thing to do is put your hand into the fire rather than to run away from it or something, then for all the will in the world, all the free will in the world, you're still going to be inclined to do the wrong thing because your brain is calculating badly. So it still relies on blind, mechanical, unrational, unconscious processes which just bubble up an opinion for him to base his freely chosen belief on. So it's really it's not even clear why. It just, the more you think about it, the wronger it gets. Right? It's just so annoying. And I mean, another way of getting into it is that he thinks, well, it can't be free, it can't be responsible. But what he means by responsible is just what his sort of theory-laden account gives you. But of course, the alternative views just have their own version of epistemic responsibility. So it's just a bit like when we talked about Frank Turek years ago, at the beginning of this series, and he was complaining on the B theory of time, there's no change, right? Well, no, that's not true. It's just that the A theory account of change isn't there on the B theory. He just fails to understand that B theorists have their own idea of what change is, right? And the determinist has their own account of what epistemic responsibility is. So when he's saying there's no epistemic responsibility unless libertarian freedom, he just means you don't have the libertarian freedom account of epistemic responsibility on determinism, which is almost trivial, and painting it as if there's no, although I think you have to have that, is just sort of question begging and gratuitous. So everything is wrong with Tim Stratton's argument. Again, just keep talking about what's wrong with it forever.
Is that a potential infinite forever or an actual infinite forever?
An absolute infinite and bigger than any cardinality. So there is no cardinality that can be given. Anyway, so then I think that in general, the problem is just the assumption that cause and effect, a chain of causes and effects, can't line up with an inference chain. Like the because of cause and effect and the because of ground consequent can never coincide is just false. And Anscombe shows that with just the robot that predicts her weight, whatever it is. But then even the thought that, well, they probably don't align is undermined, as Dan was saying, by kind of plausible accounts from cognitive science about how brain processes evolve as just any other part of the body. So then it just sort of becomes a bit of a rubbish version of the design argument that just involves different scientific literature to be consulted. But yeah, that's basically my thought.
Okay, well, that's a great way to sum it all up. If you like the content, give us a like, subscribe if you have any thoughts, put them in the comments, and we will see you next time on the SciPhi Show.